The morning mist clung to the waters of Lake Erie like a shroud of destiny on September 10, 1813, as 27-year-old Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry stood on the deck of his flagship, the USS Lawrence. The weight of an entire nation's hopes pressed upon his shoulders as he gazed through his spyglass at the approaching British fleet, their white sails cutting through the gray dawn like harbingers of imperial wrath. Perry had been thrust into this moment by circumstances that would have overwhelmed lesser men. Only months before, he had been tasked with the seemingly impossible mission of constructing a fleet from nothing in the remote wilderness of Erie, Pennsylvania. The young naval officer had watched as carpenters, shipbuilders, and sailors worked tirelessly through the brutal winter months of 1812 and into the spring of 1813, crafting vessels from the virgin forests of Pennsylvania. Every plank of wood, every iron nail, every piece of canvas had to be transported through treacherous wilderness paths to reach the shipyards on Presque Isle Bay. The British had not been idle during this time. Under the command of the experienced Captain Robert Harriet Barclay, they had maintained their stranglehold on Lake Erie, controlling the vital supply lines that connected British forces in Canada with their allies among the Native American tribes. Barclay's fleet had prowled these waters for months, intercepting American supply convoys and maintaining British dominance over the Great Lakes region. Perry's fleet consisted of 9 vessels, a motley collection of newly built ships and converted merchant vessels. His flagship, the Lawrence, named after the fallen Captain James Lawrence, whose dying words, "Don't give up the ship," had become the rallying cry of the American Navy, carried 20 guns and represented the backbone of American hopes on these contested waters. Alongside her sailed the Niagara under the command of Jesse Duncan Elliott, the Caledonia, the Ariel, the Scorpion, the Somers, the Porcupine, the Tigress, and the Trippe. As the sun climbed higher on that fateful September morning, Perry could make out the details of the approaching British squadron. Barclay's fleet numbered 6 vessels, led by the powerful HMS Detroit, a 19-gun ship that had been hastily constructed at the British naval base at Amherstburg. The Queen Charlotte, Lady Prevost, General Hunter, Little Belt, and Chippewa completed the British force. Though outnumbered in ships, the British vessels carried experienced crews who had been fighting on these lakes since the war's beginning. The strategic importance of this impending battle could not be overstated. Control of Lake Erie meant control of the entire Northwest Territory. American forces under General William Henry Harrison had been waiting anxiously for naval support before launching their planned invasion of Canada. British General Isaac Brock had recognized the crucial nature of the Great Lakes, declaring that whoever controlled these waters would ultimately control the outcome of the War of 1812 in the Northern Theater. Perry had spent the previous weeks drilling his crews relentlessly, knowing that many of his sailors were inexperienced volunteers and militia members who had never seen naval combat. He had studied every aspect of British naval tactics, poring over reports from previous engagements and consulting with veteran officers who had faced the Royal Navy in earlier conflicts. The young Commodore understood that this battle would be decided not merely by the number of guns, but by the courage and determination of the men who served them. As the British fleet drew closer, Perry could feel the tension mounting among his crew. The sound of drums beating to quarters echoed across the water as both fleets prepared for battle. Signal flags fluttered in the morning breeze, and the acrid smell of burning slow match drifted across the decks as gun crews prepared their cannons for action. This would be more than a naval engagement. It would be a test of American resolve and a demonstration of the young nation's growing maritime capabilities. The months leading up to this crucial confrontation had been marked by extraordinary efforts and seemingly insurmountable challenges. Perry had arrived in Erie, Pennsylvania, in March of 1813 to find a shipbuilding operation that existed more in theory than in practice. The task before him was daunting: create a naval fleet capable of challenging British supremacy on Lake Erie, using only the resources available in the Pennsylvania wilderness. According to historical records from the American Battlefield Trust, Perry faced immediate logistical nightmares that would have deterred a less determined commander. Every piece of equipment needed for his ships had to be transported overland from Philadelphia and other eastern cities. A journey of nearly 300 miles through dense forests and over primitive roads that became impassable quagmires during spring rains. Cannon, anchors, rigging, and even the skilled craftsmen necessary to complete the ships had to make this treacherous journey. The shipbuilding effort at Presque Isle Bay became a testament to American ingenuity and determination. Under the supervision of master shipbuilder Noah Brown, who had been recruited from New York specifically for this project, teams of carpenters worked around the clock to complete Perry's fleet. The USS Lawrence and USS Niagara, the two largest vessels in Perry's squadron, represented the pinnacle of American shipbuilding craft adapted to frontier conditions. These 20-gun brigs were designed specifically for the shallow waters and unique conditions of the Great Lakes. Meanwhile, British Admiral Robert Harriet Barclay was not sitting idly by while the Americans constructed their fleet. Recognizing the threat that Perry's growing naval force represented, Barclay attempted to blockade the entrance to Presque Isle Bay, hoping to trap Perry's ships before they could emerge into Lake Erie proper. The British commander understood that if Perry's fleet could successfully reach open water, it would fundamentally alter the balance of power on the Great Lakes. The challenge of getting Perry's ships over the sandbar that protected Presque Isle Bay became one of the most critical moments of the entire campaign. The bar, which extended across the mouth of the bay, had only about 5 feet of water at its deepest point, while Perry's larger vessels drew nearly 9 feet when fully loaded. This natural obstacle, which had initially provided protection during construction, now threatened to become a prison that would trap the American fleet indefinitely. Perry devised an ingenious solution that demonstrated both his engineering acumen and his willingness to take calculated risks. Working with his officers and the local pilots who knew the lake's waters intimately, he developed a plan to heave his ships over the bar using a system of pulleys, ropes, and floating camels, specially constructed floats that could be attached to the sides of ships to provide additional buoyancy. The operation required removing all guns, supplies, and equipment from the vessels to reduce their draft to the absolute minimum. The British fleet appeared on the horizon just as Perry was in the midst of this delicate operation, with several of his ships halfway across the bar and completely defenseless. Barclay's squadron took position just outside the bay, their guns trained on the vulnerable American vessels. For several tense hours, it appeared that Perry's entire fleet might be destroyed before it could even reach open water. However, the British commander hesitated to attack, perhaps unwilling to risk his ships in the shallow, unfamiliar waters near the bar. This hesitation proved to be a crucial strategic error. Perry's crews worked with desperate efficiency, and within 24 hours, they had successfully moved all 9 ships across the sandbar and into the deeper waters of Lake Erie. The American fleet was finally free to challenge British control of these vital waters. As the last ship cleared the bar, Perry reportedly remarked to his officers that they had just witnessed the birth of American naval power on the Great Lakes. The successful completion of this operation marked a turning point in the War of 1812's Northern Theater. For the first time since the conflict began, British forces could no longer assume unchallenged control of the lake's supply routes. Perry's fleet represented not just a naval force, but a symbol of American determination to contest British dominance in every theater of the war. As August of 1813 drew to a close, the strategic situation on Lake Erie had reached a critical juncture that would determine the fate of the entire Northwest Territory. Perry's newly completed fleet had spent weeks conducting training exercises and reconnaissance missions, gradually asserting American presence on waters that had been a British lake since the war's beginning. The young Commodore understood that his crews, many of whom had never experienced naval combat, would need every advantage that preparation and drilling could provide. The British, meanwhile, found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. Captain Robert Harriet Barclay, a veteran of Trafalgar who had lost an arm in service to the Royal Navy, faced mounting pressure from his superiors in Canada to maintain control of Lake Erie at all costs. The British Army's positions in Detroit and throughout the Northwest Territory depended entirely on naval supply lines across the lake. Without these supplies, British forces would be forced to abandon their Native American allies and retreat deeper into Canada. Barclay's challenges extended far beyond the simple matter of facing Perry's fleet in battle. The British squadron suffered from chronic shortages of experienced sailors, adequate supplies, and even basic provisions for the crews. Many of Barclay's sailors were actually soldiers from various regiments who had been pressed into naval service with minimal training. The British commander had repeatedly requested reinforcements from the Admiralty, but the demands of the ongoing Napoleonic Wars in Europe meant that few resources could be spared for the North American theater. The HMS Detroit, Barclay's flagship, exemplified both the strengths and weaknesses of the British position on Lake Erie. Constructed hastily at the Amherstburg shipyard using whatever materials could be obtained locally, the ship mounted 19 guns and represented the most powerful vessel on the lake. However, her construction had been compromised by shortages of proper materials, and many of her guns were of different calibers, complicating supply and maintenance issues significantly. Perry, by contrast, had worked tirelessly to ensure that his fleet operated as a cohesive fighting unit. He had established a comprehensive signal system that would allow coordinated maneuvering during battle, and had drilled his crews extensively on gunnery procedures and damage control techniques. The Commodore had also taken the unusual step of personally visiting each ship in his squadron to meet with officers and crew members, building the personal relationships that would prove crucial during the coming battle. Intelligence gathering became a crucial aspect of both commanders' preparations. Perry relied on a network of local pilots, fishermen, and traders who were familiar with every bay, island, and shoal on Lake Erie. These men provided detailed information about British movements and helped Perry's navigators create accurate charts of the lake's complex geography. The Americans also established observation posts on several islands, allowing them to track British movements and choose the most advantageous time and place for their confrontation. Barclay, meanwhile, struggled with limited intelligence about American capabilities and intentions. British agents reported widely varying estimates of Perry's fleet strength, and Barclay was forced to make crucial strategic decisions based on incomplete and often contradictory information. This intelligence deficit would plague British decision-making throughout the campaign and contribute to the disasters that were to follow. The psychological warfare between the two fleets intensified as September approached. Perry made several aggressive demonstrations near British positions, bringing his entire squadron within sight of Amherstburg to display American naval power to both enemy forces and neutral observers. These shows of force served multiple purposes. They boosted American morale, demonstrated to British allied Native American tribes that British naval supremacy was no longer absolute, and forced Barclay to commit to a decisive action rather than continuing his defensive strategy. The final catalyst for battle came from an unexpected quarter. British supply shortages had reached crisis levels by early September, with Barclay's crews reduced to quarter rations and his ships desperately short of essential provisions. The British commander received direct orders from his superiors to break the American blockade and re-establish supply lines, regardless of the risks involved. Faced with the choice between certain defeat through starvation and possible victory through battle, Barclay chose to fight. On September 9, 1813, British lookouts reported that Perry's entire fleet was anchored near Put-in Bay, apparently waiting for the British to accept the challenge that had been building for months. Barclay made the fateful decision to sail out and engage the Americans in decisive battle, knowing that the outcome would determine not just control of Lake Erie, but the future of British influence in the American Northwest Territory. The pre-dawn hours of September 10, 1813, found both fleets making their final preparations for what all participants understood would be a decisive engagement. Perry had positioned his squadron near Put-in Bay, using the shelter of South Bass Island to protect his ships while maintaining the ability to quickly reach open water. The American Commodore had chosen this location carefully, knowing that it would force the British to approach from the northwest. giving the Americans the weather gauge and tactical advantage in the prevailing wind conditions. Barclay's fleet had spent the night anchored near the Detroit River, with the British commander using the dark hours to address his crews and make final preparations for battle. The British squadron faced significant challenges beyond the tactical situation. Many of Barclay's sailors were actually soldiers from the 41st Regiment of Foot who had been pressed into naval service with minimal training. The chronic shortage of experienced naval personnel that plagued British operations on the Great Lakes had reached critical levels by September of 1813. As the first gray light of dawn began to illuminate Lake Erie, lookouts on both fleets spotted their opponents and began the careful process of signal communication that would coordinate the approaching battle. Perry had spent considerable time developing a comprehensive signal system for his squadron, understanding that coordinated action would be essential against the more experienced British crews. The American Commodore had also taken the precaution of briefing all his ship commanders on his battle plan during a conference held the previous evening. The wind conditions on September 10th proved to be nearly perfect for naval combat, with a steady breeze from the southwest that would allow both fleets considerable maneuvering room while maintaining good sailing conditions. Perry recognized immediately that the wind direction would allow him to close with the British fleet at his chosen angle of approach, potentially allowing the Americans to concentrate their firepower against individual British vessels before the entire enemy squadron could effectively respond. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, both fleets began the formal process of clearing for action. Gun crews removed partitions between compartments to allow for easier movement of ammunition and supplies, while Marine marksmen took positions in the rigging with orders to target enemy officers and gun crews. The ritual of preparation for naval combat in the age of sail involved hundreds of specific procedures that had been refined through centuries of maritime warfare. Perry had made one crucial decision that would prove instrumental in the battle's outcome. Rather than attempting to maintain formation and engage in the traditional line of battle tactics favored by most naval commanders of the era, he decided to concentrate his fire on the British flagship HMS Detroit and her principal consort, HMS Queen Charlotte. This tactical innovation reflected Perry's understanding that destroying British command and control would be more effective than attempting to engage the entire enemy fleet simultaneously. The British fleet approached in line-ahead formation, with HMS Detroit leading, followed by HMS Queen Charlotte, HMS General Hunter, HMS Lady Prevost, HMS Little Belt, and HMS Chippewa. Barclay's plan called for his more powerful ships to engage Perry's flagship USS Lawrence, while his smaller vessels attempted to prevent the American support ships from interfering with the main action. This conventional approach reflected British naval doctrine, but failed to account for Perry's unconventional tactical innovations. At approximately 11:45 in the morning, the USS Lawrence opened fire with her long-range guns, beginning the Battle of Lake Erie with a thunderous broadside that echoed across the water for miles. The opening shots fell short of their intended target, but they served notice to both fleets that the long-anticipated confrontation had finally begun. Within minutes, both squadrons were fully engaged, with the roar of cannon fire drowning out all other sounds across the contested waters. The initial phase of the battle appeared to favor the British, whose more experienced gun crews achieved better accuracy and rate of fire than their American opponents. HMS Detroit and HMS Queen Charlotte concentrated their fire on USS Lawrence, Perry's flagship, which began to suffer significant damage within the first 30 minutes of combat. American casualties mounted rapidly as British round shot and grape shot swept the Lawrence's decks, killing and wounding sailors and Marines with devastating effect. Perry's tactical plan, however, was more complex than it initially appeared. While USS Lawrence bore the brunt of British fire and suffered accordingly, the American Commodore was positioning his other ships for a decisive intervention that would change the battle's entire character. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic reversals in naval history, as Perry prepared to demonstrate that American determination could overcome British experience and firepower through innovative tactics and sheer audacity. The USS Lawrence had become a floating hell by noon on September 10, 1813, as British cannon fire methodically dismantled Perry's flagship with devastating precision. The ship's deck ran red with the blood of American sailors, and the air was thick with smoke from burning rigging and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Of the Lawrence's crew of 103 men, 83 had been killed or wounded, leaving Perry with barely enough hands to continue fighting his guns. Captain Robert Harriet Barclay aboard HMS Detroit had reasons to feel confident as he watched the systematic destruction of the American flagship. His veteran gun crews had maintained a superior rate of fire throughout the morning, and their accuracy had proven devastatingly effective against Perry's inexperienced sailors. The British commander could see through his spyglass that the Lawrence was listing badly and appeared to be on the verge of surrender, which would effectively end American resistance on Lake Erie. However, Barclay had made a crucial error in focusing so intensely on destroying Perry's flagship. While HMS Detroit and HMS Queen Charlotte concentrated their fire on the Lawrence, they had allowed the USS Niagara, under the command of Master Commandant Jesse Duncan Elliott, to remain relatively unengaged and undamaged. This 20-gun brig represented the second most powerful ship in Perry's squadron, and her preservation would prove to be the key to American victory. The moment that would define the Battle of Lake Erie came when Perry made one of the most audacious decisions in American naval history. With his flagship crippled and his crew decimated, the young Commodore decided to transfer his command to the Niagara and continue the fight from a fresh ship with an intact crew. This decision required extraordinary personal courage, as Perry would have to cross several hundred yards of open water under direct British fire in a small rowing boat. Perry's transfer from the Lawrence to the Niagara became one of the most famous episodes in American naval history. The Commodore took with him his battle flag, which bore the dying words of Captain James Lawrence, "Don't give up the ship." As Perry's boat crew rowed desperately toward the Niagara, British marksmen in the rigging of HMS Detroit and HMS Queen Charlotte directed concentrated fire at the small target, understanding that killing or capturing the American commander would end all organized resistance. The 15-minute journey across the blood-stained waters of Lake Erie tested every ounce of Perry's courage and determination. Musket balls and grape shot churned the water around his boat, and several members of his rowing crew were wounded during the crossing. Perry himself remained standing in the stern of the boat, presenting a clear target to British marksmen while directing his crew's efforts to reach the Niagara as quickly as possible. When Perry finally reached the Niagara and climbed aboard, he found a ship and crew that were still fresh and eager for battle. Master Commandant Elliott had kept his ship at long range during the morning's fighting, preserving both vessel and crew for the decisive moment that was now at hand. Perry immediately assumed command and began implementing the second phase of his battle plan, which would demonstrate American naval innovation at its finest. Perry's tactical masterstroke involved sailing the Niagara directly through the British line, a maneuver known as crossing the T that would allow him to rake multiple enemy ships with devastating broadsides while minimizing return fire. This audacious move required precise seamanship and perfect timing, as any miscalculation would result in the Niagara being surrounded and destroyed by superior British firepower. As the Niagara approached the British line, Perry ordered his gun crews to load their cannons with double charges of grape shot, turning each gun into a massive shotgun that would sweep enemy decks clear of personnel. The American ship's approach created confusion in the British formation, as Barclay's ships found themselves unable to concentrate their fire effectively against the rapidly moving target. The Niagara's passage through the British line created carnage on an unprecedented scale. Her broadsides, fired at point-blank range into the sides of British ships, caused massive casualties and structural damage that effectively crippled Barclay's squadron within minutes. HMS Detroit, already damaged from the morning's fighting, suffered particularly severe casualties when the Niagara's guns swept her quarterdeck, killing or wounding most of her senior officers, including Captain Barclay himself, who was severely wounded by grapeshot. The psychological impact of Perry's bold maneuver proved as important as its physical effects. British morale, which had been high during the morning's successful attack on the Lawrence, collapsed as sailors witnessed the systematic destruction of their squadron by a single American ship. The tide of battle had turned completely, and what had appeared to be certain British victory was rapidly becoming an American triumph of historic proportions. The devastating passage of USS Niagara through the British line had fundamentally altered the character of the Battle of Lake Erie within the span of 20 minutes. Captain Robert Harriet Barclay, severely wounded and bleeding from multiple grapeshot wounds, watched helplessly as his carefully planned formation disintegrated under the relentless pounding of American gunfire. The British commander's flagship HMS Detroit had suffered catastrophic damage, with her main mast shot away and her gun decks littered with dead and dying sailors. HMS Queen Charlotte, the second most powerful ship in the British squadron, found herself in an equally desperate situation. Her captain had been killed early in the Niagara's attack, and command had passed to a lieutenant who had never before commanded a vessel in battle. The ship's rigging was so badly damaged that she could barely maneuver, and her gun crews had been decimated by the successive American broadsides that had swept her decks. Perry, meanwhile, had seized the tactical initiative completely. After breaking through the British line, he brought the Niagara around to engage the enemy ships from their vulnerable stern positions, where they could bring few guns to bear in return. The American Commodore's innovative tactics had achieved what traditional line of battle formations could never have accomplished: the complete disruption of British coordination and the systematic destruction of their fighting capability. The smaller British vessels, HMS Little Belt, HMS Chippewa, and HMS General Hunter, attempted to escape the carnage by fleeing toward the Canadian shore, but Perry had anticipated this possibility. The American schooners USS Ariel, USS Scorpion, and USS Trippa had been positioned to intercept any British ships that might attempt to break off from the main engagement. These smaller American vessels, though individually less powerful than their British opponents, worked in coordination to surround and capture the fleeing enemy ships. The final moments of the Battle of Lake Erie demonstrated both the courage of the combatants and the terrible cost of naval warfare in the age of sail. Captain Barclay, despite his severe wounds, attempted to continue fighting from the quarterdeck of HMS Detroit until the ship's remaining officers convinced him that further resistance was impossible. The British flagship's colors were finally struck at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, followed shortly by the surrender of the remaining vessels in Barclay's squadron. Perry's victory was complete and unprecedented in American naval history. For the first time since the Revolutionary War, an American fleet had defeated and captured an entire British squadron. The strategic implications of this triumph extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation on Lake Erie. British forces throughout the Northwest Territory would now be cut off from their supply lines and reinforcements, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the entire region. The cost of victory had been substantial for both sides. American casualties totaled 27 killed and 96 wounded, with the heaviest losses occurring aboard USS Lawrence during the morning's fighting. British casualties were equally severe, with 40 killed and 94 wounded, including Captain Barclay and most of his senior officers. The human cost of the battle reflected the intensity of the fighting and the determination of both sides to achieve decisive victory. Perry's famous dispatch to General William Henry Harrison, written immediately after the battle, captured both the drama of the engagement and its historic significance. "We have met the enemy and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." This laconic message, sent from the deck of HMS Detroit while British officers were still being treated for their wounds, announced to the American nation that control of Lake Erie had finally been wrested from British hands. The surrender ceremony aboard HMS Detroit provided a striking contrast to the carnage that had preceded it. Perry, demonstrating the chivalrous behavior expected of naval officers in the early 19th century, ensured that British wounded received immediate medical attention and that captured officers were treated with appropriate dignity. Captain Barclay, despite his wounds, was able to surrender his sword to Perry in a formal ceremony that marked the end of British naval supremacy on the Great Lakes. The capture of the entire British squadron provided the Americans with valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions throughout the Northwest Territory. Documents found aboard the captured ships revealed the desperate supply situation facing British forces and confirmed that enemy morale was beginning to crack under the pressure of prolonged warfare. This intelligence would prove invaluable in planning the American invasion of Canada that would follow Perry's victory. As the sun set on September 10, 1813, the strategic situation in the Northwest Territory had been completely transformed. The Battle of Lake Erie had demonstrated that American naval forces could not only compete with the Royal Navy, but could defeat British squadrons through superior tactics, determination, and innovative leadership. The immediate aftermath of Perry's victory at Lake Erie sent shockwaves throughout both British and American command structures, fundamentally altering strategic calculations for the remainder of the War of 1812. Within hours of the battle's conclusion, Perry had dispatched fast messengers to carry news of the triumph to General William Henry Harrison, who was waiting anxiously with his army near the Sandusky River for naval support to begin his long-planned invasion of Canada. Harrison received Perry's victory dispatch on September 12th, and the news electrified the American forces that had spent months in frustrating inactivity while waiting for control of Lake Erie. The general immediately began implementing plans for an amphibious assault across the lake, knowing that British forces in Detroit and throughout the Northwest Territory were now cut off from their vital supply lines and reinforcements. The strategic initiative in the Northern Theater had passed completely to American hands. The British reaction to news of Barclay's defeat demonstrated the catastrophic nature of the loss for imperial strategy in North America. General Henry Proctor, commanding British forces in Detroit, found himself in an impossible position with Perry's fleet now controlling the lake. Without naval support, Proctor could neither supply his troops nor maintain his alliance with Tecumseh's Confederation of Native American tribes, who had been promised continued British support in their struggle against American expansion. Proctor's decision to abandon Detroit and retreat deeper into Canada marked the beginning of a British collapse in the Northwest Territory that would culminate in the Battle of the Thames and the death of Tecumseh. The evacuation of Detroit, which had been a symbol of British resistance since the war's beginning, demonstrated how completely Perry's naval victory had transformed the strategic landscape. American forces occupied the city without resistance, marking the first significant territorial gain in the Northern Theater. The international implications of the Battle of Lake Erie extended far beyond North American boundaries. News of an American naval victory over the Royal Navy reached Europe at a time when British forces were heavily committed to the final campaigns against Napoleon. The defeat served notice to European powers that the United States had developed significant military capabilities and could no longer be dismissed as an insignificant former colony unable to challenge British maritime supremacy. Perry's innovative tactics at Lake Erie influenced naval doctrine for decades to come, demonstrating that aggressive leadership and unconventional approaches could overcome traditional advantages in experience and firepower. The Commodore's decision to transfer his command during battle and his use of concentrated firepower against selected targets became case studies taught at naval academies throughout the world. American naval confidence, severely damaged by early defeats in the war, was restored by Perry's demonstration of effective leadership and tactical innovation. The political impact of the victory proved equally significant for the young American Republic. President James Madison's administration had faced severe criticism for the conduct of the war, particularly following the British capture of Washington and the burning of government buildings. Perry's triumph provided the administration with its first major victory to announce to the American people, helping to restore public confidence in the war effort and the competence of American military leadership. The battle's outcome also had profound effects on American naval development and shipbuilding capabilities. The success of vessels constructed in the Pennsylvania wilderness demonstrated that American shipyards could produce warships capable of defeating the world's most powerful navy. This achievement encouraged expanded naval construction programs and contributed to the growth of American maritime industries that would play crucial roles in the nation's economic development throughout the 19th century. Perry's victory established him as one of the first genuine American naval heroes, earning him promotion, congressional recognition, and permanent fame in American military history. His famous battle flag, bearing the words, "Don't give up the ship," became an enduring symbol of American naval determination and courage under fire. The Commodore's willingness to risk everything in pursuit of victory exemplified the kind of leadership that would characterize American military doctrine for generations to come. The strategic consequences of the Battle of Lake Erie ultimately extended to the war's conclusion and the Treaty of Ghent. British negotiators, aware that their position in the Northwest Territory had become untenable following Perry's victory, were forced to abandon demands for territorial concessions and accept a return to pre-war boundaries. The battle's outcome thus contributed directly to the preservation of American territorial integrity and the successful conclusion of the War of 1812. The legacy of September 10, 1813, endures as a testament to American naval prowess and the decisive impact that superior leadership and innovative tactics can have on the course of history. Perry's triumph at Lake Erie stands as one of the most complete naval victories in American history, demonstrating that the young republic possessed both the resources and the determination necessary to defend its interests against the world's greatest naval power.